Welcome to Secret Love Story, where we explore deeply emotional stories about love and family. Today, we embark on a new journey, sharing heartfelt and profound moments of love and the challenges of family life. Let's embrace these wonderful emotions together. The groom abandoned the bride after becoming a millionaire, and years later, he meets her again with quadruplets. Are these children his? Why did he take her to court? This dramatic and surprising story will keep you glued to the screen. Let's find out. Let's embrace these wonderful emotions together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new information. Claire Mitchell stood in front of the full-length mirror, her wedding gown flowing around her like a sea of satin and lace. The gown was perfect, an intricate design of pearls and embroidery that shimmered with every movement. Her dark hair was pinned back in a loose, elegant bun, leaving a few soft curls framing her face. She smiled as she admired her reflection, her heart beating with excitement and nerves. Today was the day she would marry David Stone, one of New York City's most powerful and wealthy men. Everything had been meticulously planned for months, and the moment had finally arrived. As she touched the delicate fabric of her gown, Claire thought about how her life had changed since meeting David. He was charming, ambitious, and had swept her off her feet with promises of a life beyond her wildest dreams. She had grown accustomed to the luxury and grandeur that came with being by his side, and today, it all felt like the culmination of their whirlwind romance. But as the minutes ticked by, something felt wrong. Claire's phone, which had been silent all morning, buzzed loudly from the vanity table. She furrowed her brow, wondering who would be calling at such a time. A flutter of anxiety twisted in her chest as she crossed the room to pick it up. It was David. Her heart skipped a beat. Maybe he's just checking in, she thought, trying to reassure herself as she answered the call. But as soon as she heard his voice, her world began to tilt. "Claire, we need to talk." His tone was cold, distant, nothing like the David she knew. The words that followed shattered her in ways she couldn't have imagined. "I'm calling off the wedding. I can't go through with it. My business needs my full attention right now, and I can't afford any distractions. I'm sorry." The words echoed in her ears, but it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. Claire's mouth went dry, and she struggled to process what he had just said. Canceling the wedding? Now? Minutes before the ceremony? She couldn't breathe. The room around her blurred as tears stung her eyes, disbelief and shock quickly transforming into a crushing sense of abandonment. "But David, everything is ready. The guests, the church, the reception." Claire's voice trembled as she tried to make sense of his decision, her mind racing for an explanation. "I know," he interrupted, his tone devoid of emotion. "But it's over. I need to focus on my company. Goodbye, Claire." The line went dead, leaving Claire standing in her wedding dress, frozen in disbelief. Her phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud, but she barely noticed. It was over. The man she thought would be her husband had just walked out of her life, leaving her standing at the altar, alone. For what felt like an eternity, Claire couldn't move. She stood staring at her reflection, the image of a bride who would never walk down the aisle. The future she had envisioned with David, the glamorous life, the endless possibilities, vanished in an instant. A knock at the door startled her. One of the wedding planners entered, her face lighting up at the sight of Claire in her dress. "You look stunning. Are you ready? It's almost time." But the planner's smile faltered as soon as she saw Claire's tear-streaked face, her trembling hands clutching the sides of her gown. "Claire? What's wrong?" Claire couldn't find the words. She just shook her head, tears falling freely now. The planner rushed over, taking her by the shoulders. "What happened?" Claire's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. "David, he called it off. He's not coming." The planner's face turned pale. "What?" "But, everything's set. The guests, the ceremony." She trailed off, realizing the gravity of the situation. "I know," Claire said, her voice breaking. But he's gone. Minutes later, Claire found herself in the back of a car, still wearing her wedding gown. The church, the guests, the carefully arranged flowers, all of it was behind her now. There was no ceremony, no vows, no promises of forever. Only the crushing silence of her heartbreak. As the city blurred past the window, Claire closed her eyes, willing herself to hold it together. But the tears wouldn't stop, and the pain of David's betrayal cut deeper with each passing moment. He had abandoned her, just like that, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Her life of luxury, her place by David's side, had vanished in the blink of an eye. Now, she had no idea where to go or what to do. All she knew was that she had to find a way to survive this, somehow. But how do you move on when everything you had ever dreamed of is ripped away in an instant? As Claire's car disappeared into the crowded streets of New York, she clutched her hands together tightly, feeling the weight of the life she had just lost. She was no longer Claire Mitchell, the soon-to-be wife of David Stone. She was simply Claire, heartbroken, abandoned, and utterly lost. And the worst part? She had no idea what was coming next. Claire Mitchell's world was a far cry from the lavish lifestyle she once knew. After David's sudden abandonment, she found herself renting a small, modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, a stark contrast to the penthouse she once shared with him. The grandeur, the wealth, the plans for a life together, it was all gone. Days bled into weeks as Claire tried to adjust to her new reality, the ache of David's betrayal still fresh. She kept to herself, rarely venturing beyond her small apartment unless it was for work. Gone were the fancy parties and high-profile events. Now, her life revolved around a quiet solitude, trying to rebuild the pieces of her life from the ground up. She had taken up 2 part-time jobs, neither of which fulfilled her, but both were necessary to keep a roof over her head. The bills were piling up, and Claire was doing everything she could to stay afloat, determined not to sink into despair. But there was no denying how much she was struggling. She had gone from the promise of a life of luxury to scraping by on minimum wage, all while nursing the wounds of a broken heart. Each day felt like a battle, and Claire wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. She wanted to disappear, to leave the memories of David and her old life behind. But just as she began to adapt to this new chapter, something unexpected happened. If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button. Loi Kagoi. It started with an overwhelming fatigue. Claire had been working long hours at both jobs, so she chalked it up to exhaustion. But then came the nausea. It hit her in waves, usually in the morning, leaving her dizzy and unsettled. Claire tried to ignore it, but the symptoms only worsened with each passing day. Finally, after a particularly rough morning, she decided to see a doctor. Maybe it was the stress of the past few months catching up with her. Maybe her body was finally giving in to the pressure she had been under. Sitting in the clinic's waiting room, Claire felt a mixture of anxiety and dread. She had never been one to visit the doctor unless absolutely necessary, but this time, something felt off. When the nurse called her name, she followed with hesitant steps, not quite ready for whatever news awaited her. The examination was brief, and the doctor asked her a series of routine questions. When he suggested taking a pregnancy test, Claire laughed. It seemed impossible. After all, she hadn't been with anyone since David, and they had been careful, or so she thought. But the test results were undeniable. The doctor returned to the room with a serious expression, handing Claire a piece of paper with the results. Her heart pounded as she read the words, "Positive." "I don't understand," Claire stammered. "This can't be right." But the doctor confirmed it. She was pregnant. And not just with one baby, she was expecting quadruplets. 4 lives growing inside of her. 4 children who would soon depend on her for everything. Claire's mind went blank, the enormity of the situation crashing down on her all at once. "How far along am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "About 8 weeks," the doctor replied. "You'll need to start prenatal care immediately. This is a high-risk pregnancy, given that it's multiples." Claire nodded numbly, trying to absorb the information. 8 weeks. It had been 8 weeks since David had walked out on her, since he had left her standing at the altar. That meant these were his children. David Stone's children. As she left the clinic, Claire's thoughts raced. She had to make a decision. She had to figure out what to do. But one thing became clear to her almost immediately: she wasn't going to tell David. He had already abandoned her once. She couldn't bear the thought of him swooping in and trying to claim a place in her life again, especially not now, when everything was so fragile. No. Claire would raise these children on her own. She would find a way to give them the life they deserved, without David Stone's interference. She had done it before, surviving on her own, and she would do it again. Only this time, she wouldn't be alone. Claire Mitchell had never imagined herself as a single mother, let alone to 4 children at once. Yet here she was, juggling multiple jobs and raising her 4 boys, Ethan, Lucas, Jacob, and Noah. Each day was a blur of feeding, changing, and caring for them, but Claire remained fiercely determined. She had made a promise to herself that she would provide for them, no matter the cost. The boys were a handful, full of energy and curiosity, and they grew quickly. Each of them inherited David's striking blue eyes and blonde hair, a constant reminder of the man who had walked away from them before they were even born. Claire couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions every time she looked at them. She loved her children fiercely, but the resemblance to their father sometimes brought back painful memories. Despite the challenges, Claire made it work. She took on as many shifts as she could, working late nights and early mornings at whatever job she could find. Some days, it felt like too much, but the thought of giving her boys a good life kept her going. She lived for their laughter, their smiles, and their small victories. Each milestone they reached reminded her that everything she was sacrificing was worth it. As the boys grew older, Claire became more protective of them. She knew she had to keep them away from David's world. The wealth and power that he wielded were things she wanted no part of anymore. She didn't want her boys to be swept into the same cold, business-first mentality that had led David to abandon her. They deserved better. They deserved to grow up knowing they were loved and cared for, no matter how hard life got. But Claire's life was about to take an unexpected turn. One afternoon, 3 years after the boys were born, Claire took them to the local park to play. It was a rare day off for her, and she relished the chance to spend some time with her children without the pressure of work hanging over her head. The sun was shining, and the boys were laughing as they chased each other around the playground. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. That was, until she saw him. David. He was walking through the park, dressed in a sharp suit, his phone pressed to his ear. Claire froze, her heart skipping a beat as she watched him from a distance. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the day he had left her standing at the altar. The shock of seeing him now, so unexpectedly, sent a wave of panic through her. She turned her back, hoping to avoid being noticed, but it was too late. David's eyes had fallen on her, and then on the boys. The recognition was immediate. His gaze shifted from Claire to her sons, and Claire could see the realization dawning on him. The boys, with their matching blonde hair and blue eyes, were unmistakably his. There was no hiding it. He approached slowly, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. Claire's heart raced as she struggled to figure out what to say. She couldn't let him back into their lives. Not now. Not ever. Claire, David said, his voice low and careful, as if he were afraid to startle her. These boys, they're mine, aren't they? Claire's mind raced. She had promised herself she would never let David know the truth. She couldn't risk him trying to take the boys from her or getting involved in their lives after all these years. She had raised them on her own, and she wasn't about to let him ruin everything she had built. No, she lied, her voice firm. They're not yours. David blinked, clearly taken aback. Claire, they look exactly like me. They're not yours, Claire repeated, this time more forcefully. I moved on, David. You left me, remember? You don't get to come back now and question my life. David stood there, stunned into silence. Claire could see the doubt flickering across his face, but she held her ground. She couldn't let him get close to the boys. Not after everything that had happened. After a tense moment, David nodded, though his eyes still lingered on the children. "I see," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to run into you like this." Claire crossed her arms protectively over her chest. "Neither did I." Without another word, David turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing there with her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as he disappeared into the crowd, her mind racing with a mix of relief and fear. She had managed to keep the truth from him, for now. But deep down, Claire knew this wouldn't be the last time David crossed paths with them. David Stone was not a man who accepted defeat easily. The encounter with Claire at the park had left him with far more questions than answers. He couldn't shake the sight of the 4 boys who were undoubtedly his children, no matter what Claire had said. The resemblance was too strong, too undeniable. After years of moving on with his life, the idea that he might have sons, 4 of them, gnawed at him relentlessly. A week after that fateful day, David decided to take action. If Claire wouldn't give him the truth, he would find it himself. He hired a powerful lawyer, one with a reputation for winning high-stakes custody battles. Together, they filed a legal claim for a paternity test and eventual custody of the children. David was determined to have a place in their lives, even if he had to fight for it. When Claire received the legal papers, her heart sank. She had done everything she could to shield her boys from David and his world, but now it was all falling apart. The reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. She couldn't keep the truth hidden anymore. If the courts ruled in David's favor, she could lose her children. The legal battle was brutal. David's lawyer attacked Claire's character, painting her as an unstable woman who had hidden the existence of the children out of spite. They questioned her ability to raise 4 boys on her own with her limited financial resources, implying that David's wealth would provide them with a far better life. Every day felt like a new nightmare, and Claire struggled to keep herself together as the case dragged on. But it wasn't just the court battle that weighed heavily on her. David's fiancée, Isabel Blake, had inserted herself into the situation, making things even worse. Isabel was beautiful, poised, and everything Claire wasn't. She had a vision of a perfect life with David, and the idea of his 4 sons fit neatly into her plans. Isabel made it clear that she intended to be a part of the boys' lives, whether Claire liked it or not. Claire was overwhelmed by the mounting pressure. Isabel had become a constant presence, attending court hearings with David and showing up at every opportunity to flaunt her influence. She spoke about the boys as if they were already part of her future, as if Claire had no say in the matter. It was infuriating, and Claire felt as though she was being erased from her own children's lives before her very eyes. As the custody battle intensified, the court hearings revealed Claire's struggles as a single mother. Her financial records were laid bare, exposing the tightrope she had been walking to provide for her sons. The opposing side didn't hold back, using every hardship she had endured against her. They claimed that Claire's refusal to tell David about the boys was proof that she was unfit to be their sole guardian. But Claire fought back. She stood her ground in court, refusing to let anyone take her children from her. She had raised them from the day they were born, giving them everything she could despite her limited means. She loved them, and that love had been enough to carry them through the hardest times. Claire knew that no amount of money could replace the bond she had with her sons. David, on the other hand, struggled with his own guilt. The more he saw Claire in court, the more he was reminded of the way he had abandoned her all those years ago. The image of her standing alone, raising their sons without his help, haunted him. He had left her to fend for herself, and now he was trying to take the boys away from her. It didn't sit right with him, no matter what Isabel or his lawyer said. But Isabel was relentless. She believed that Claire was unstable and unfit to raise the boys and pushed David to go after full custody. Isabel envisioned a future where she and David raised the boys together, with Claire completely out of the picture. The thought of it made Claire's blood boil. Claire felt the weight of everything closing in on her, but she refused to give up. Every day, she returned to court with her head held high, determined to show the judge that she was the best mother her boys could have. She wasn't going to let David or Isabel take them from her. The battle seemed endless, but Claire knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't stop fighting. The boys were her world, and she would do whatever it took to keep them by her side. As the custody battle raged on, tensions between David and Isabel began to rise. Isabel had pushed for full custody, confident that David's wealth and influence would overpower Claire's case. But David was no longer as sure as he once was. Seeing Claire in court, listening to her fight for their sons, had stirred something in him, a deep sense of guilt and responsibility. He had abandoned her, left her to raise their children alone, and now he was trying to take them away. It felt wrong, and the more Isabel pushed, the more uneasy David became. Isabel, however, wasn't one to back down. She saw the boys as a perfect addition to her life with David and wasn't about to let Claire stand in the way. She began to manipulate the situation, encouraging David to view Claire as unfit and emotionally unstable. Isabel was determined to win, no matter what it took. But her tactics were beginning to backfire. David, once easily swayed by her ambition, started to see the cracks in their relationship. He had always admired Isabel's confidence and drive, but now it seemed more like a thirst for control. As the custody hearings dragged on, the wedge between them grew deeper. David found himself questioning not just the battle for custody, but his entire future with Isabel. Claire, on the other hand, was growing stronger. Each day in court, she stood firm, refusing to let anyone take her children from her. The legal battle had drained her physically and emotionally, but she knew she couldn't give up. The boys were her life, and she had sacrificed everything to raise them. She wouldn't allow David and Isabel to tear that apart. The courtroom became a battleground, with lawyers presenting every possible argument for and against Claire's ability to care for her sons. Her struggles as a single mother were put on full display: her finances, her living conditions, the long hours she worked just to make ends meet. But through it all, Claire remained resolute. She had raised her boys with love, and no amount of money or power could change that. David's lawyer continued to push the narrative that the boys would be better off with their father, citing his ability to provide a life of luxury and stability. Isabel added fuel to the fire, insisting that the boys deserved more than what Claire could offer. But as the hearings went on, it became clear that David wasn't as eager as Isabel to win full custody. The turning point came during one particularly intense court session. David had been asked to testify about his intentions regarding the children. He had prepared a statement with his lawyer, but as he took the stand, something shifted. He couldn't bring himself to go through with the script Isabel had pushed him to follow. Looking at Claire, seeing the determination and love in her eyes, David felt a deep pang of regret. He knew that she had been a good mother. Despite the hardships, she had raised their sons with strength and grace. He couldn't deny that anymore. "I made a mistake," David admitted, his voice breaking the tense silence of the courtroom. "I left Claire when she needed me most, and she's been raising our boys on her own ever since. I can't take them from her." His lawyer looked stunned, and Isabel's face hardened, but David didn't care. He was done with the lies, the manipulation. He couldn't continue the battle, knowing it would hurt Claire and the boys even more. "I want to be in their lives," David continued, his voice steady now. "But I believe Claire is the one who should have primary custody. She's their mother, and she's done an incredible job. I just want a chance to be a father to them." Isabel's anger boiled over after the hearing. She couldn't believe David had turned against her, undermining everything they had fought for. Their relationship, already strained, began to crumble under the weight of the custody battle. Isabel's obsession with winning, with controlling the situation, had driven a wedge between them that couldn't be repaired. David's decision changed the course of the case. The judge, moved by his admission and Claire's unwavering dedication to her children, ruled in Claire's favor. She would have primary custody of the boys, with David granted supervised visitation. The court recognized Claire's sacrifices and her ability to provide a loving home, despite the financial struggles. As the ruling was handed down, Claire felt a rush of relief wash over her. The battle was finally over. She had fought for her children, and she had won. Though exhausted, she knew she had secured their future, free from the fear of losing them to David's world. Isabel, furious with the outcome, packed her bags and left David's life. Her plans to control the situation had fallen apart, and David's realization that he didn't want the life she was building had ended their relationship. She had been so focused on winning that she had lost sight of everything else, and in the end, she lost David as well. Claire, now stronger and more determined than ever, turned her focus back to her children. She had fought the hardest battle of her life and had come out on the other side with her family intact. David's role in their lives would be limited, but Claire was at peace with that. She knew now that she had everything she needed, her boys, her love for them, and a future she could finally shape on her own terms. After the courtroom battle ended, Claire Mitchell finally felt a sense of peace return to her life. The judge's decision had been in her favor. She would retain primary custody of her 4 boys, and David would only have supervised visitation. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. The emotional toll the fight had taken on her was immense, and the fear of losing her children had haunted her for months. Now, she could finally begin to move forward, knowing they were safe with her. David had kept his word, though. He didn't fight the court's decision after the verdict. He began visiting the boys regularly, making an effort to build a relationship with them. But it was on Claire's terms. The visits were supervised, ensuring that David couldn't overstep the boundaries set by the court. Despite her initial fears, Claire found that David was respectful of her role as their mother. He didn't try to undermine her or force his way back into their lives as he once had. Claire was cautious at first, watching David closely during each visit. He played with the boys, asked about their interests, and slowly began to carve out a place for himself in their lives. Though they were still young, Ethan, Lucas, Jacob, and Noah were naturally curious about their father. Claire could see the excitement in their eyes when David arrived, but she also noticed how tentative he was with them, as if trying to figure out how to be a father to children he hadn't been around for the first few years of their lives. Over time, Claire began to relax around David. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know the boys, and while she would never fully trust him after everything that had happened, she realized that having him in their lives might not be the worst thing. He was their father, after all, and as long as he respected the boundaries, Claire could live with that. Meanwhile, Isabel Blake was nowhere to be seen. After David's decision to support Claire's custody rights, Isabel had left his life entirely. Their relationship had crumbled under the weight of her need for control, and David had no intention of reaching out to her. He had his own life to rebuild now, one that didn't include the manipulations and power plays Isabel had tried to impose. For Claire, this was a chance to finally focus on what truly mattered, her children and her own personal growth. The past few years had been filled with struggle and heartbreak, but she had come out stronger on the other side. The fear and uncertainty that had once gripped her now gave way to a quiet determination to create the best possible life for her boys. With the custody battle behind her, Claire threw herself into her work and her role as a mother. She was able to reduce her hours at one of her jobs, finding more time to spend with her children. Her financial situation began to stabilize, and she no longer felt like she was constantly on the edge of losing everything. Slowly, she started to rebuild her life, piece by piece, knowing that she had weathered the storm and emerged victorious. David's role in the boys' lives remained limited. He continued his visits, but they were infrequent, and Claire made sure to keep them supervised. She still couldn't fully trust him, but she no longer felt the same anger and resentment she once did. Instead, she focused on her future and the future of her children. In time, Claire found herself growing stronger. The battles she had faced had not broken her, they had made her more resilient. She was no longer the woman standing in a wedding dress, waiting for a man who never showed up. She had become someone who could stand on her own, who could raise her children without relying on anyone else. Claire also began to explore new opportunities in her career. With her confidence restored, she applied for positions she would have never considered before, and eventually, she found a job that offered her both financial stability and personal fulfillment. It wasn't easy, nothing ever was, but Claire knew she could handle whatever challenges came her way. As the years passed, Claire and her boys thrived. The love she had for them had always been enough to keep her going, and now it felt like the future was finally hers to shape. She no longer looked back at the past with bitterness or regret. Instead, she saw it as part of the journey that had led her to this point, a place of peace, strength, and purpose. David remained in their lives, though his presence was far less impactful than it could have been. The boys knew their father, but they also knew that Claire was the one who had been there for them through every hardship. She was the one who had fought for them, sacrificed for them, and built a life for them. They understood, even at their young age, who their true parent was. As Claire stood at the window one evening, watching her sons play in the backyard, she smiled. The battles of the past were behind her. She had her children, her independence, and her peace of mind. And that, she knew, was worth everything. Thank you for reading this story. See you in a new and better story.